Okay. So what is scrap metal? I thought I just did. Well, I didn't say it was from the footnote. So this concept of finely divided fine powders or friable materials is in the footnote in 66261.24 in the table, and it's in footnote B. The other piece to keep in mind is when materials are scrap metal under the federal system and excluded under the federal system, the effect of that exclusion is to remove the TCLP from applicability in California. So you don't even need to consider the TCLP when characterizing those materials because EPA doesn't regulate them as hazardous. And that happens via 66261.24A1. So what is scrap metal? Scrap metal in California, in the California regulations, consists of basically metal items that are hazardous because of the metals, and they have to be in a finely divided or fine powdered form, okay? But then scrap metal goes a step further and says fine powders are not scrap metal. So basically, the only things left that are scrap metal are things that are in a finely divided state, all right? So most of these things make sense: metal workings, cuttings, trimmings, stampings. We'll come back. Grinding, shaving, sandings. Okay. Residues in metal production like drosses. Those things are really what the scrap metal exemption covers in California. Now there's some problematic words here like manufactured solid metal objects and products and printed circuit boards. Okay, but like we saw with the copper penny in the chrome bumper, those sorts of solid metal objects aren't hazardous to begin with. So they're not in the universe of hazardous waste, so the scrap metal exemption doesn't let them out of hazardous waste regulation. Does that make sense? Sort of. You got to be in to get let out. Okay. And I mentioned that fine powders are not included. Subsection B of the scrap metal provision excludes a whole bunch of stuff, including lead acid batteries, which we just talked about, magnesium borings, beryllium borings, any metal contaminated with a hazardous waste, such that the metal exhibits a characteristic of a hazardous waste. Okay, and obviously that would be a characteristic due to the contaminants, not the metal itself. And any metal contaminated with an oil that is a hazardous waste and is free flowing. And finally, here we go again, sludges and fine powders and semi-solids and liquid solutions. Well, those first two, they knock out a whole lot of stuff that might otherwise be scrap metal. So you see, the scrap metal exemption in California is very, very narrow as compared to the federal scrap metal exemption. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm not sure. I'll let you. Okay. Question comes up often is, does scrap metal have to be reclaimed? Does it have to have its metal values recovered to get the scrap metal exemption? Okay. There's nothing explicit in the California regulation that says it does. All right. In the EPA system, EPA says metal has to be recycled, but they don't necessarily say it has to be reclaimed. All right. So in the end, the California scrap metal definition is different than the definition of scrap metal in federal regulations. Okay. It excludes certain items from regulation as hazardous waste, meaning those materials have to be hazardous waste to begin with in order to get scrap metal exemption. Unlike the federal system where scrap metal is a category of a secondary material and a waste, which may be excluded before you even get to the hazardous step. Okay. Okay. You have to pay attention to the definition in 66260.10. The item should be made predominantly out of metal, and you have to make judgment calls when you're talking about scrap metal. Any questions on that? Yeah. Okay. So you start here. I have these shavings, and they could be solid metal residues or metal workings, right? So they are potentially scrap metal. Let's presume they're hazardous for a minute, okay? Then we get down to number 6, and we say, are these shavings fine powders? Right? If the shavings are fine powders, which is defined as 100 microns, then they are not scrap metal, and they do not qualify for the exemption. Okay? Shavings are just like grindings in my mind. Any other questions? Scrap metal? How about oil filters? So oil filters are an example of a material that could be hazardous because they're contaminated with oil, right? If they were just a chunk of metal, they would probably qualify for the RCRA scrap metal exemption. And in the state system, they'd probably be non-hazardous. They'd be elemental metals. But there's a regulation that allows oil filters, okay, that are hazardous to be managed as non-hazardous, okay? And that regulation then prompts that the oil filters have to be drained to get rid of that oil, okay, to the extent feasible, okay? So it's kind of like facilitating getting the oil filters into the scrap metal exemption, okay? In order to qualify for this regulatory exemption, the oil filters have to have some metal components in the filters, okay? It's kind of following the scrap metal exemption. Today we're seeing a lot of plastic oil filters in cars, and we don't have a regulatory solution for those guys yet. Okay. And so the next question comes up is, what about hydraulic oil filters? All right? Can they be used oil filters? So obviously the regulation was written for oil filters such as that on the engine of your car, but as a judgment call, a hydraulic oil filter could also qualify as a used oil filter. All right? So here's an example, a locomotive oil filter with steel core and end plates. What do you think? Could that qualify as a used oil filter? Sure. Okay. As long as it goes for recycling and it's drained first, gets labeled, no problem. I think I already gave you this example. A hydraulic fluid filter from an aircraft, could that qualify as an oil filter? Yes, provided what? Provided it has metal, but more importantly, provided the hydraulic fluid is oil. Okay. What if the hydraulic fluid is not an oil? Then it's not an oil filter and probably not a used oil. Okay, you got it. Again, details, details, details. Okay, so a couple years ago, the legislature said fuel filters can be managed like oil filters. So they piggybacked a statutory exemption on top of a regulatory exemption, which was already piggybacked on top of another regulatory exemption. And so we have Health and Safety Code 25250.22. This allows fuel filters to be managed with oil filters, okay? When you do that, you have to containerize and label the filters, and you have to include that the container contains fuel filters on the label. Any residual fuel must be managed as a hazardous waste. So under the oil filter regulation, the oil that collects in the bottom of the oil filter drum has to get collected and be managed as used oil. Here, if you have fuel that's collecting in the bottom of the drum, it has to be managed as a hazardous waste. Okay. Like the oil filter regulation, the fuel filter statute says the filter must be drained, okay? And it must be recycled for its metal content, okay? There's been a DTSC policy decision that this exemption can also apply to dispenser filters from gasoline pumps. So just like we were expanding the used oil filter exemption to apply to hydraulic oil filters, other kinds of oil filters, DTSC has expanded this exemption to cover dispenser filters. Again, they have to have some metal, though. So here's some pictures of filters. These guys look like metal, right? So they easily should qualify for the exemption. How about here? Not the bottom. There's no metal at all. How about the top one? Sure, why? Anyone have an old GM with that like stone ceramic looking fuel filter in the carburetor? Or am I dating myself? No metal there either, right? So probably not for those fuel filters. Yeah. All right. So again, the fuel filter exemption or the oil filter exemption should not apply to non-metal filters. Okay? And there is currently no exemption that I can think of that applies to those. What about a little metal? Okay, there's no cutoff. There's no objective standard. So on that filter on the bottom, I had one guy with the black rubber fuel line about that long on each end, and it had those little squeeze pinch clamps that are made out. He said, "Oh, it's got some metal." Well, I pointed out that clamp wasn't part of the filter and said no. But again, there's no cutoff. Okay, so think about it. Retrograde, real quick. I'm not following your question. I can't. So, yeah. So it has to be scrap metal under RCRA to get out. That's maybe I didn't emphasize the point enough. So EPA doesn't have a regulation or a statute that specifically says fuel filters are exempt. We have such an animal in California, but there's nothing in the EPA system. So this is one of these areas where you have to kind of apply the law with RCRA consistency in mind. So if I have this filter, and it's got the paper filter element, the filter element contains benzene, and it's hazardous, TCLP hazardous, right? Then EPA might exclude that filter as scrap metal if it had a metal component, okay? Okay, good. So I'm out of RCRA now. I can go to the state statute and find a way to deal with my filter. But what I can't do is just kind of just apply the state statute alone and forget this requirement that EPA requires it to be metal and be recycled. Okay? So I have to put it all together when I'm doing my application of the law and regulations. Does that help clarify? Yeah. So when you get to those plastic filters, well, why aren't they out? And one of the reasons they're not out is because you're not out under RCRA in any way. It's a RCRA hazardous waste, and the state can't be less stringent than RCRA. So EPA has this category or this exclusion for commercial chemical products being reclaimed. This is in that Table 1 in 66261.2. And so under EPA's scheme, an unused commercial chemical product that goes to get reclaimed is not a solid waste and not a hazardous waste indefinitely. California didn't pick up that exclusion, but we have a provision called retrograde material. And retrograde, the word, means going back to the manufacturer. So I like to think of the retrograde provision as a limited version of EPA's commercial chemical product being reclaimed exclusion, okay? The definition of retrograde basically says you have a hazardous material which is not going to be used for its intended purpose because it's off spec in some way, or the way that it was stored, it damaged the product, or that it's been banned by law, or it can't be used for reasons of economics or health and safety reasons. Right? Almost anything can fit into the retrograde materials provision. The most important part is that the material is not going to be used, sold, or distributed in some way for some reason. All right. If that's the case, you have such a material that's not going to be used, sold, or distributed, and it meets one of those retrograde requirements, then if you send that material back to the original owner for reclamation or use, or if the original owner reclaims or uses that material within a period of 1 year, that material is not a solid waste, not a waste in California, and not a hazardous waste. Mm-hmm. So basically, there's actually up to 2 years. You have a year from it becoming retrograde at the generator site to get back to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer can get up to another year. So almost 2-year exemption, but it has time limits, unlike the EPA exclusion. All right. For the most part, this applies to commercial chemical products, although the state regulation in 66261.2 applies the retrograde materials provision to sludges and byproducts as well. Right. The material going back as retrograde can either be reclaimed or used. So, for example, an ammonium fertilizer could go off and get used as a fertilizer, okay, in a similar like application. If it goes back to the original manufacturer, the material must go to a manufacturer at least very similar to the original manufacturer. So if you took a bunch of photographic film that was made by Kodak, sending it back to Fuji for reclamation might be okay, But sending it to Walmart for reclamation probably wouldn't work. They're not the original manufacturer. Here's the definition. It's long and kind of has a lot of ambiguities in it, I would say. Like, what is originally intended or prescribed manner or purpose? Anyone got any idea? Where would you find such a thing? I mean, intended. I mean, I can tell you what something was probably designed to do. I could probably find instructions or, specifications from a manufacturer. But when you're talking about an owner who has a material, how do you know what someone originally intended to do with the material? Okay, so you get into some real good questions in trying to apply this law, especially refineries. So that's it on retrograde, unless you have questions. Yeah. And what's the other? Fine. Right.
But we keep using it in small amounts. It's now
10 years.
8 years after its expiration. We are still using it for its intended use. If an inspector comes in, sees somebody with an expired on the box, looks at the date of expiration in 2004, what's the conversation I'm likely to have?
Depends on the inspector, but first, what is it when you say 10 to 1, you mean 90% water, 10%. So it's probably not hazardous in the first place. But let's assume it is. Yeah. Let's say who does the test. Anyway, it's probably not. But if it were hazardous, it still would not be a waste, and it would not be. It's not discarded in any way in the scenario that you've described. Where it would become discarded in some way is if you did something that, kind of signaled an intent to store it forever and ever and ever beyond that expiration date and not use it, right? And then you get into accumulated speculatively or what some of the, yeah. Or just go back with the same magic marker or another magic marker and say, but okay to use. It's true that they're expired. Anyone can detect that, whether the box is labeled that way or not. But if you say, what's a good way to do this? Let's say I had two processes side by side, and one was a pharmaceutical process where the use of a expired chemical was probably taboo and forbidden by numerous regulations, right? But it had another process that was making something else where it didn't matter, okay? So the fact that it's expired doesn't make it spent or unusable in this one process, but it does in this other. And so,
I've got a similar situation where a cat takes a bottle of photorealism that has passed its life expectancy by a day. Written expired on it, put it on the shelf, inspectors come by and said, you wrote expired on it, that must be a waste.
okay.
And in that case, they're right, because we don't intend to use that anymore. Okay? But in the other case, of the disease chapter, we have to
No, it's not a waste. There's a letter, Camp Systems, you can download off our website that addresses that. All right, so we just looked at retrograde, which is like CCP, and then we have earlier talked about excluded recyclable materials, and then we talked about scrap metal, garage exemptions. Question that comes up often is how much time is allowed for a material to sit around or store, just like this expired chemical thing. And the answer in part is it's different depending on what provisional law you're looking at. So as we saw with retrograde materials, you can have 1 year at the original owner's site and another year at the manufacturer. For ERMs, we saw the sample calculation earlier. For the first year, there could be no requirement whatsoever on the recycling. The second year, you have to have recycled 75% of the material that was stored on January 1st. And so the time frame for allowing a material to be on site can vary. More importantly, the 75% doesn't apply to any specific material under that scenario. So an actual individual material could sit there for a really long time as long as you meet the 75% requirement. Okay. Here's an example of spent lead-acid batteries like we did earlier, but here the battery's not spent. It's a defective lead-acid battery made by a manufacturer. And if the manufacturer were to take this and reclaim it, right, in their process, then that material would be retrograde and not subject to those spent lead-acid battery regulations. Mm-hmm. So the battery plates are defective or they're off-spec in some way. They're reclaimed by the original manufacturer. It's retrograde, okay? You often see this in high-tech lines where they incorporate salvage lines into the production process. Yep. You don't know in this scenario because they didn't give you enough information. But what I was envisioning here is that maybe the whole battery's no good. Maybe the terminal connections are bad, but the plates inside the battery are still perfectly good. So he can dismantle that battery, get back the plates, maybe get back the separators, reclaim certain components from the defective battery, and then use those reclaimed components back in the production process. I was envisioning him using the plates again in a new battery that hopefully wouldn't be defective this time.
He's talking about this being a battery manufacturer.
Yeah.
So it hasn't been sold yet.
It goes back into the production process. Yeah. Yeah, you can. So it's used, sold, or distributed. So you only need one of those to not happen. Okay, so it could be sold, it could be distributed, but not get used before they ever use it. They find out it's no good. Right? At that point, it could still be retrograde. If you got no, it's not. It doesn't say it has to be unused. It says not used, sold, or distributed. Okay, so you have to have one of those three. So normally, once it's been distributed for sale and once it's been sold, all that's left is normally the use. So for most part, once the material leaves the production facility, you're looking at use. Right. Once it's used, you're outside of retrograde and you're back into the rest of it. Sure. It'd have to meet some requirement. It's, likely in this example, it's off spec because of the nature in which the material was stored. They don't want to use it. Yeah. So it meets that, and then if it went back to the manufacturer and the manufacturer reclaimed it or repackaged it, it'd be fine. Let's say they filter the dirt out of it, make sure there's no bugs in the bottom of the container or whatever. They might not have to do much, right, if it's still in good condition. If it was spilled on the ground, they might have to do a whole lot to reclaim it. Right. Yes, yes. Okay, we did expired chemicals, so I'm going to skip this. So here's a retrograde example. It's the same example you were giving. So you have paint cans, but the expiration date passes. Okay. The cans have never been opened. Okay, but I can still use that paint. In that case, it's not a waste. It's just paint, right? But if I can't use the paint and I send it back, then it could be retrograde material. How about this example? I have a race car with fuel, and the fuel is no longer usable. Could that be retrograde? What do we know? It's probably been sold. It's probably been distributed. It's almost been used by getting put into the fuel tank, and we said it's not usable. So you're probably not going to meet can't be used, sold, or distributed in that case, right? And the other thing is, of course, with a fuel, is a refinery or someone of that sort of company going to want to take back 5 gallons or 10 gallons of fuel out of a car? Probably not, right? How about this example? We're pulling out an old UST, and there's a residue in the bottom of it. You think that could be retrograde? It's sold, it was distributed. What's the first thing that pops in my mind? It's probably past the 1 year at this point, right? Okay. When you get to fuels, sometimes retrograde materials can apply to fuels, right? But it's not common. The example I often give is you go drive home today, you get in an accident, and your car gets towed to the junkyard. The insurance company calls you the next day, and they total your car. You don't really want that fuel. It's been sold, it's been distributed, it hasn't been used, it's sitting in the fuel tank, it hasn't burned yet. And then the original owner, which is now the wrecking yard, they decide to use that fuel on site within 1 year, right? It's probably a retrograde fuel. Any questions on that? Yeah, we did that. I'm going to skip latex paint. Used oil, okay? We're going to touch on used oil briefly, okay? And why would I discuss used oil here? So as you all know, used oil has to be managed as a hazardous waste. But there's 2 ways related to recycling that used oil can get out of hazardous waste regulation in California, okay? And so since this is recycling exclusions and exemptions, we'll talk about that. All right. I want to say, though, that most often used oil does not exhibit a characteristic of a hazardous waste, but it's still regulated as such. Okay. So sometimes when you get into the recycling exclusions and exemptions, one of the things that may be encountered there is the fact that the material is not hazardous and not a recyclable material. So you have to keep that in mind. So what is used oil? Just review. Used oil is any oil, petroleum or synthetic, that has been used, okay, for its lubricating or heat transfer purposes, and that has then been removed from service. Once it's removed from service, it's used oil, okay? Used oil does not include oil with flash points less than 100 degrees or oil with PCBs greater than 5 ppm, and it does not include used oils with halogens greater than 1,000 ppm unless someone makes a rebuttable presumption demonstration under the rebuttable presumption provisions. Right? Used oil does not include vegetable oils, animal oils, and cooking oils. So how do I get my used oil out of regulation by recycling it? Okay? The first way that Diana talked about earlier is through a 25143.2 exemption, and then I have to recycle the used oil through use or reuse on site, okay? And then the E7 override prohibition would allow the recycling to take place. So the classic example is a facility changes their used oil either changes. They remove their used oil from a car or a piece of equipment, a gearbox or something, and they use that used oil for another purpose, like lubricating a drag chain conveyor or using it as bar oil in a chainsaw on site. Okay. They don't do any processing to that used oil, so it's use for reuse, and it's on site. Okay. The other way you can get used oil out of regulation is through testing each batch and showing the used oil to be recycled oil. Okay. So in Health and Safety Code 25250.19, there's a requirement for you to test each batch of used oil and keep records of the testing if you want to call your used oil recycled oil. And if you do the testing and the oil meets these standards, the used oil or the recycled oil purity standards, then the used oil is declared recycled oil and it's no longer used oil. Okay? The standards here are basically the same as the federal standards, except for the PCB provision. Again, like I said, under 25250.19, you have to test each batch. And under 25250.18, you have to keep records of where the recycled oil went to. For a lot of people, this is a big deal because used oil can be their biggest waste stream sometimes. And that's it.